The following podcast is a Devine Media production.
Christianity has become known for judgy people, strange words, ancient stories, confusing rules, and a members-only mindset. This is why I stayed away from the church for so long, but it's not supposed to be that way. I'm Jill Devine, a former radio personality with 3 tattoos, a love for a good tequila, and who's never read the entire Bible. Yet here I am hosting a podcast about faith. The Normal Goes a Long Way podcast is your home for real conversations with real people using real language about how faith and real life intersect. Welcome to the conversation.
Well, hey guys, it's good to be back for another stories episode at Normal Goes a Long Way. And today we are talking to, I'd say, one of the main reasons I'm actually pursuing a master's right now at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. We're talking to a guy named Ben, who I approached probably a year and a half ago, trying to figure out a way to get into pastoral ministry without going to Concordia Seminary. Problem is, this guy works for Concordia Seminary, and I should have known that going in, and he convinced me to go. So now I'm pursuing my master's, and Ben is on staff there.
Wait a minute. So what does it mean to get your master's in a religion school? Like, I know what it means to get it at a regular university.
I'll give my answer, and then Ben will give his professional paid position answer.
Okay.
My answer is it means you go to classes so that you can. So I'm already working at a church, but now I get to do more at a church because I've got my master's.
Okay.
Like, I get to preach.
Oh, you become like a pastor.
Yes. But not everyone gets a master's at a religion school to become a pastor, because there's also female students that are getting a degree in their deaconess studies.
Okay, what's a deaconess?
All right, Ben, I'm exhausted at my knowledge here.
He's exhausted at me.
I love it. I'm so honored to be on with you, Ryan and Jill, and just so excited about what you're doing. I think podcasting is a lot of fun. I have a podcast myself, and so with a friend of mine named Micah. And so, honored to be on, and honored to talk a little bit about Concordia Seminary and whatever else you both want to talk about. A deaconess, to answer Jill's question, is someone who serves in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in our church body as a woman who is trained theologically in a robust way, not just a few classes on religion or something, but really thorough training in how to read and understand the Bible, how to understand the history of the church, how to understand a little bit of the church's core teachings, and then how to actually practice. And so for a deaconess, the practices of ministry often are, they can be a whole bunch of different things. It could be like running a women's shelter, or it could be running a preschool. It could be helping at a church as a youth director, or it could be working at a retirement community or a nursing home of some sort. So a deaconess is a woman that has lots of theological education and then can go into a whole bunch of different realms and put her faith to work in service to her neighbor.
Actually, our pastor's daughter's a deaconess just up the road, and she does youth ministry there. So there's your example. I've known others to be missionaries overseas. So
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Now, then let's go to the other question about the master's. And besides it maybe giving the title of pastor, what else would someone be going to a religious school to pursue their master's?
We have kind of 2 master's degrees, at least 2 kinds. One is what's called a professional master's degree. So it's kind of like getting a master in business administration or a master's in education. It's really geared toward, it's academic, it's a master's degree, but it's geared toward practicing something, toward doing something. So an MBA gives you the theoretical and the practical frameworks to do business or a master's of education makes you a better educator. So a master's of divinity or a master of deaconess studies gives one the practices to do ministry, like how to preach, how to visit shut-ins, how to create and write Bible studies, how to lead faith-based organizations, congregations, and that sort of thing. So we could have so we have people that come from practical masters primarily that are either going to be a pastor or a deaconess to serve in the church. Then we also have some academic master's degrees. That's more like if you were going to get a master's degree in history or a master's degree in philosophy or English, where you just come and study theology, and it's not really necessarily for any particular purpose. It's just kind of continuing education or preparation to get even another degree, like a PhD or something like that. So, yeah, we have people from around the world that come and take our master's degree in theology. We have a lot of students from Africa and Asia who then go back and are theological educators back in their hometowns. So yeah, it's a fun place to work.
Now, I know Ryan did not ask you to come on here to talk about education, really, and I have all these questions. So let me ask this. As someone who has received her undergrad and master's at a public sector, could I just attend or get my master's? Would I have to like go to the undergrad side first and then get a master's if I wanted to go that route for ministry? Like, how does that work for those people like me?
Great question. This is I see what's going, and I like it. Um,
Maybe.
um, so you do not have to have an undergrad in theology or in Bible or anything to enter our master's program. So in order to get into our master's program, you have to have a bachelor's degree in anything. Um,
Oh,
and and then yeah, you can take a master's degree and get a master's in theology, and there would be a ton of electivity in our master's degree. Our MA in theology is probably our most kind of flexible degree. So you can take a bunch of different stuff depending on what's being offered. So it might be a course on a particular book of the Bible, or it might be a course on something practical like how to give spiritual care to people or how to teach the faith. So, yeah, anybody can come.
good to
This is
know.
actually good because believe it or not, Jill, so we had an Ask the Pastor night recently. I had 75 to 80 middle schoolers write down any question they could ask a pastor. And after questions about heaven, questions about how to become a pastor or why you become a pastor was like the second most popular one. So
Hmm.
I don't know. Kids are interested in how to become this thing that they see on a stage on Sundays.
It's
So,
very intriguing to me.
yeah.
And
That's
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's awesome, and I think it says a lot about the pastors and church workers at Messiah, right? Because in our day today, people want to follow in the footsteps of people that they trust and admire, and they're not going to do something just because they feel some duty or obligation. Probably, it's much more likely that they're going to pick a profession because they've personally been impacted in some way. And so, yeah, I think that says a lot about what y'all are doing.
And then at the beginning of this episode, you mentioned that you had a podcast. Go ahead and tell me the name of that, and then I'll let Ryan take over.
All right, yeah, I was starting to go down that trail, and then I thought, I don't want to be like
No.
doing a shameless
Yes.
plug. So now that you've asked, all right, I'll. So our podcast is called Under the Fig Tree, and it's a podcast specifically about potentially going into church work. So if
Oh.
you're looking, there are several Under the Fig Tree podcasts, but ours is kind of has a beige background and an olive green big fig tree. So that's us under the fig tree, Ben Haupt and Micah Glenn.
I will have that at our show notes at normalgoesalongway.com. Okay, so Ryan,
Well,
it's your turn now.
Yeah. I think Ben's
This is
point
good.
about
I love it. This is a great podcast. This is just the way ours is too. Very conversational.
Yes.
All over the place. Love it.
Yep.
Well, Ben, you made a point that people look to their pastors and are intrigued by them because of their relationship with them, and they look to them for guidance. And I think a pastor's role sometimes is to both affirm and uplift people where necessary, but also sometimes to challenge them and to invite them into something greater.
Yeah.
And you actually just wrote a book about a pastor in a very unique place at a very unique time. This is what made me want to interview you. I found Ben one day on campus and I said, I heard you're writing a book. And he said, yeah, it's about this German pastor with a difficult to pronounce name who served as a pastor in Germany in the 30s. And I thought, well, that's an interesting time to be a pastor in Germany, because there's some stuff going on there if you know your history.
I don't.
So I'm going to let Ben give the historical background. But politically speaking, this was a challenging time to be a pastor, and it was a challenging time to be the church. And I think what you talked about with this pastor could teach us today, right, in our American context, where we vote, Christians get to have a voice in politics, and we're almost expected to. And every election cycle, doesn't matter what year it is, people want to know, what are evangelicals supporting? Where are evangelicals going in their political support? So all those things came together to make me say, I want to know more about what you learned from this pastor and what you know about Christians and their place in the political world.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I'm delighted to talk a little bit about this book. I will give an initial apology. So the book is a very academic book published by a great publisher, T&T Clark. They're owned by Bloomsbury, who are the publishers of Harry Potter. I'm a big fan. And so I thought, wow, it would be really cool to get published by the same printing house that prints Harry Potter. I think we probably won't sell as many copies as Harry Potter. And for that reason, publishers have to pick a price for the book that kind of covers their costs. So right now the book is sitting at a whopping $105 a copy. So I'm hopeful that I will sell some copies to academic libraries and professors and such. And if we sell enough copies in the academy, then the price of the book will probably come down to like a regular book, like 20 or 30 bucks once they get the first run done. So consider this a kind of an intro, and if you have an academic library where you could ask for it, you can probably ask for it, but I'm not putting anybody up to buy it for $105 a copy. Which, by the way, I don't get any money. I don't get anything from that. All the proceeds go to a foundation that honors the legacy of this pastor. So, without further ado, let's talk about this guy. His name is Hans Joachim Iwand, I-W-A-N-D. So, kind of looks like Iwand or Iwand, but he would have pronounced it Iwand. As a good German boy. So let's just call him Hans, because I think that's probably, it's a very German sounding name, but that's most easily pronounced. So Hans was born in what is today basically Poland, and he was born in 1899. So he came of age. He graduated and was ready to go to university in 1917, which was, as our listeners may know, in the middle of World War I. World War I wouldn't end until 1918. And so Hans grew up in a really kind of tumultuous time. There was a world war going on, and he was called up to serve in World War One. Listeners might know another interesting writer that grew up and in this time and had a very similar story in some ways. J.R.R. Tolkien was born right around the same time, and as a young man served in World War One. I just read a great book called Tolkien and the Great War by John Garth. The stories that are told of World War One and being in the bunkers. Maybe listeners have seen recently. What's the movie? All Quiet on the Western Front.
Oh yeah, I've seen that. That's
hard.
What
a horrific movie, right?
Yeah.
And so these young men were they were not women serving in the trenches. Certainly, a lot of women serving kind of behind the scenes and caring for soldiers and that sort of thing. And it was impactful on everybody. But these scenes of being in the bunkers and the trenches in World War One, oof. So Hans kind of he goes off to war, and then shortly after the war ends, he decides to go and study theology. And I wonder, I mean, I think living through really tough stuff has a way of focusing somebody on what's truly most important in life. And I think Hans kind of had this sort of experience. He gets caught up in some political movements. He at one point he was at a rally that Adolf Hitler was also at. I saw in my research, and it was just this crazy time of people trying to figure out what's the right way to go. And there's all these riots and protests. And as a young man, I think he was just kind of caught up in all of it, sort of the way that probably a lot of people today are caught up in all the craziness of riots and protests, and there's a lot of tough things going on in our world today, and so a lot of this similar unrest. So he decides, given all this craziness in the world, I think I want to study theology. He had a mentor that he really got to know well, and the mentor said, you really ought to come and study theology. So he goes off and studies theology, and he becomes a professor. Then he's kind of back and forth in a bunch of different places, but he finally kind of makes it as a professor. He publishes his first book in 1926, and he starts teaching at the University of Königsberg, which is way over. It's
in Russia now, right?
Russia now. Yeah. So he's teaching there, and in 1932, he's kind of the like kind of pastor and professor all in one at this house of students. And in 1932, a bunch of SA troops, which is kind of a precursor to the SS, which eventually becomes Adolf Hitler's kind of army. These troops come in and they kind of raid his house, and they tell him that he's going to be deposed and fired from his position because he had written some things that were kind of controversial. He was not a big fan of this guy Adolf Hitler, who was potentially coming to power, and so Hitler started to round up people that were not getting in line, and a lot of this stuff was going on behind the scenes in Germany. There wasn't a lot of talking about it early on in the days. In one point, Dietrich Bonhoeffer in 1933, who's also maybe your listeners know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was another Lutheran pastor, had a very, very similar early life as Hans did, studied theology, and then in 1933, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was on a radio broadcast, and he said some things that were pretty critical of the new Führer, the new leader. Hitler didn't like the term that the leader of the German people had been given, and so he came up with his own title, and it was Führer. And Bonhoeffer said some things that were not real kind about that. He was really quite nervous about a leader that just had all power and could do basically whatever he wanted, and everybody was just kind of in line and said, "Yes, whatever you want to do, we'll do." And it was this terrifying kind of raw assertion of power. Maybe you've heard of Lord Acton, who once said, "Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely." And so Bonhoeffer and Hans Evant start talking about how challenging it is for this raw assertion of power, this absolute power, how corrupt it was. And they started to talk about how Christians should really be aware of what is going on in the government, because the government was basically telling Christians what to think and what to say. And Bonhoeffer and Hans didn't like that very much, and they had a lot to say about how the church should respond to society.
It's interesting that they were set against this absolute ruling that you were talking about, because if Hans was born in Germany in 1899, well, he was born under an authoritative ruler then, because Germany was under a king, right? And so that's interesting that it seems like his attitudes had shifted when it came to absolute power and that sort of thing. Maybe I'm wrong here, but he grew up in a monarchical system anyways. But what I'm really curious about is, you mentioned he was at a rally with Hitler. It sounded like in the 20s or 30s, but how did his politics change? Was he on various sides? Was he figuring himself out during that interwar period before coming down on this position that we now know him for historically?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So as far as the king thing goes, there's a great book called "The Guns of August" by Barbara Tuchman, and she has this really interesting scene at the beginning of the book in 1914. This is before Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated. A ruler in Austria. The scene is there are all these kings of all these different countries and kind of people groups, right? So there's the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the British Empire and the German Empire and the Prussian Empire. And all of these, a bunch of these kings are kind of riding in a parade at the beginning of this book. And Tuchman basically points out that nothing like this would ever happen again. So World War I was basically the end of kings being rulers over states or nations or countries in the West. And what comes after World War I is new systems of, this is ultimately what World War I is about, creating a new system that's based on choice, and democracy is a much more important thing, becomes a much more important thing, especially in Western Europe. So by the time Hitler comes to power in the 30s, there isn't a king, but more of a somewhat democratically elected leader.
These two guys, these pastors in Germany, you mentioned Bonhoeffer and you have Hans here. you mentioned that Hitler at that point and the government was taking stances against the church, right? Proposing ideologies, proposing things that these pastors felt went against their beliefs. I'm curious what exactly those things were, because in the early 30s, you know, this is not the 1940s, and so I'm actually not super familiar with how Hitler's agenda and how the government's programs had developed. So what were they specifically opposing at that time?
We have so much more to learn from Ben, and so we're going to hit pause on this week's conversation, and then I hope you will join us for the continuation of this conversation next week when we launch part 2. And here's a little sneak preview.
Oftentimes when people preach about the parable of the Good Samaritan, they love to talk about what we should do or how we should help our neighbor. But the real question of that parable is, who is my neighbor? What Christians really need to think about is, who is our neighbor? The obvious answer of help our own is not what Jesus was getting at with that parable. Our neighbor is the person that we most fundamentally disagree with. Maybe even the person that we've come to hate because of their position on something